Welcome to Money Talks. This week we're going to discuss commercial property. What are the essential differences between residential and commercial property? And which makes the best investment? When you invest in residential property, you're essentially dealing with people. When the rent's late, you have to deal with a person, the tenant. If you feel the property is not being looked after properly, you'll have to deal with people who may have a different opinion from you. With commercial property, you're essentially dealing with contracts. If the rent's not paid on time, then the contract or lease agreement stipulates a series of remedies that the landlord can take. If the property is not kept up to a certain standard, then the contract may stipulate that you can send in a commercial cleaner and send the bill to the tenant. Generally, governments around the world have countless rules governing the renting of property to residential tenants, which override just about anything you may put in your rental agreement. For example, in the UK, if a tenant's behind with their rent, you can't just evict them. There are all sorts of protections in place so that the tenants will not be exploited. You have to allow them to fall behind with their rent for at least 30 days before you can start eviction proceedings. With commercial property, what is in the lease contract is generally what goes. Many commercial leases have a clause in them that stipulates that if the rent is late by more than a week, then penalty interest will be applied to the amount of rent outstanding. If the tenant still hasn't paid the rent a certain period of time thereafter, then you have the right not only to change the locks and take your premises back, but also to seize all the tenant's fittings, furniture and equipment on the premises and to sell them to recover your rent owing. Your rights as a commercial landlord are far stronger than those as a residential landlord. With commercial property, the tenants usually derive their income at your premises. Therefore, they have a vested interest in keeping your property in good condition. With residential tenants, there's not the same drive to maintain your property, let alone improve it. With my commercial property, I spent thousands of pounds changing the business from a men's hairdresser's, which it had been for the previous 30 years, into a real estate business. In fact, for the first couple of years, we often had some very bewildered men coming into the property and looking inside, expecting to have their hair cut. With a commercial lease, the tenants often paint their premises every couple of years so that it will be attractive to customers. In fact, in a commercial property, the tenant is responsible for whatever maintenance repairs occur. So if there's a plumbing problem in a commercial property, it's up to the tenant to bring in his own plumber and to be responsible for whatever bills are presented to him. In a residential property, the tenant is entitled to call the landlord or the management company. They're compelled by law to fix whatever repairs are necessary. Another fundamental difference between residential and commercial property concerns the typical length of the lease. With residential properties, it can be on a month-to-month basis, but is rarely longer than maybe 3 or 5 years. Commercial properties, on the other hand, are generally leased for many years at a time. From the tenant's perspective, it gives their company or business the security of the same premises to work out of. Banks like long-term leases as well. The longer and stronger the lease, the more willing they are to lend money on the property. In some countries, a tenant cannot rent the premises with a lease that's under 5 years. Now, there's an upside to this and a downside to this. The upside is that his business is secure in that location for at least 5 years. He can't be asked to move. The downside is that if times are bad, he might be able to pay his rent. He might not be able to pay his rent and there's no wiggle room to get out of that lease. So in the end, he possibly could lose everything. He could lose whatever deposits he's put down. He could lose his furnishings, his equipment. He could theoretically lose the essence of his business. So far, you can see there's a lot of advantages of commercial properties over residential ones. So let's summarise the main categories of commercial property. You've got retail, shops or any building where passing trade or the general public are invited. Then there's office, commonly found with retail or alone and often above the retail areas on the ground floor. And finally, industrial, which is places where things are manufactured or services are provided, but not necessarily where the general public are walking past. Don't go away, I'll be right back.